Hi, I'm Jen from Tea Leaves and Tweed, and here I talk about all things tea. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy, be sure to subscribe to follow more of what I do. This morning I'm sharing another Baking with Jen treat to go with your tea. So today we're going to be baking French gingerbread, or pain d'épices. Now, I first found this recipe for pain d'épices when I was searching for something to bake to eat for my first breakfast when I wake up early in the morning. And I wanted something a little bit sweet, but not too sweet and not too sugary, and maybe that had some whole grain flours in it. And I had a big bag of rye flour that I bought for my sourdough experimentation, so I figured it would be nice to have a bread that was made with rye flour. And I also had a giant jar of honey because I love our local honey. So I just looked for a rye and honey cake, and this is what came up. And then after I made it for the first time, I was curious because there is one thing about the recipe that was very odd to me, and that was that it had no butter or oil in it. So I looked it up to see if this was a traditional recipe, and it is. So pain d'épices is a traditional French cake or bread. There are mentions of it going back to the 16th century, and in the 1694 Dictionnaire de l'Académie Française, there's an entry for pain d'espice, because French still kept the S in there, that says it is a bread made from rye flour, honey, spices, and something that they call escume de sucre. And when I looked up escume de sucre, it looks like the word escume means scum. So it's actually the unrefined sugar from like the sugar scum that happens during sugar processing. So I found that really interesting too. So I took the original recipe that I found and I made some adaptations based on my own tastes and some of the historical references that I found, and I put together this kind of modern and historical recipe. I think this is very much the culinary version of history bounding, because while I am going to use the unrefined sugar that it calls for in the recipe, I'm also going to use chemical leavener, which in this case is baking powder. So I'm no Max Miller, but I think today we might have a little taste of history. So let's bake. So this is a recipe that has you mix your wet ingredients and your dry ingredients and then mix them together. So I'm going to start with my wet ingredients. And I have my unrefined sugar, in this case sucanat, but something like jaggery or panela or rapadura would also be pretty similar. And I'm going to take a 1/4 cup of that and put it into my wet ingredients bowl. And then I'm going to add ½ cup of boiling water, which I just got from the kettle. And then I'm going to give these a little whisk together. And then I'm going to just let that sit so that the sugar can dissolve. And then in my dry ingredients bowl, I'm going to sift together 1 cup of plain flour. This is actually bread flour. It's a flour that I get freshly milled from a local farm. And this is Glen wheat. But you could also just use white whole wheat flour or any plain flour. And then I'm going to use one cup of whole rye flour. And this again is from a local farm, and I will link them below because I love their flour. It gives everything such a beautiful flavor. Switching to their flours not only has meant that I've had flour throughout this pandemic, but also makes my baked goods taste so much better. And then I'm going to take 2 teaspoons of baking powder. This is the modern touch. Originally this would have been made with barm yeast or sourdough leaven. Of course, baking powder and baking soda were not introduced until the mid-19th century, so this cake was around for hundreds of years before then. And now the spices. So there are many different combinations of spices that you can use for this cake. But these are my favorite combination. So I'm gonna start with cinnamon, which I have this beautiful cinnamon from Calabash Tea in Washington, D.C. And I'm gonna use kind of a rounded teaspoon of cinnamon. And then a teaspoon of ground ginger. And then half a teaspoon of black pepper. And this is what really makes it for me. I love the fact that this cake has black pepper in it. It gives it kind of a different taste than your typical gingerbread or spice bread or like pumpkin spiced thing. Of course, I have to grind my pepper. That's about a half a teaspoon. I do mix my pepper with grains of paradise, so that affects the flavor a little bit, but this at this point is mostly pepper. And then I'm going to grate in some nutmeg. So I have my little jar of nutmegs. Oh, I get to start a fresh one today. And I have my microplane grater. And we'll just grate in a nice healthy amount of this. I think officially you're supposed to grate in like a half a teaspoon's worth of nutmeg. But, you know, I used that much of a nutmeg. Then you sift this together, which both takes the lumps out of the flour and also mixes the ingredients. And I just push those last little clumpy spices through the grater, through the sifter. And then we'll put our dry ingredients to the side and revisit our wet ingredients. So our sucanat has dissolved nicely in our hot water, which is nice. One of the things I love about this cake is that this method of making it means that you don't get those like little clumps of sucanat that you sometimes get when you bake with it, because it doesn't dissolve quite as easily as even brown sugar. So now you add a cup of honey. And I have a local wild rose honey. I usually just use a wildflower honey, but my spouse was feeling fancy this week. So I'm going to add a cup of that to this wet bowl. And try not to make too big of a mess. Give that a little mix, just so that there's not a big blob of honey at the bottom. It smells amazing. And then you want to put in 2 eggs. And one of the reasons I like to do the boiling water and sugar step first is because that way I can let it cool off a bit so that it doesn't cook the eggs. You just mix that together. And now we simply have to pour the wet ingredients into the dry ingredients and mix it together. I think I'm going to switch to a wooden spoon so I don't fling batter everywhere. I realize I forgot to add salt, so I'm going to just do that now. That's a half teaspoon of salt. I would normally have added that with the boiling water to help the salt dissolve and evenly flavor the cake, but this will probably be good too. So we'll give that a little stir. And now we just need to get it into our tin. So I have a loaf tin that I've buttered and lined with some parchment paper. I'm going to just tip our batter in. Oh, it smells so good, the honey and the spices together. I'm so excited for this. I have made this a few times since I found this recipe. It is one of our favorites. And then this just needs to go in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for about 45 minutes to an hour, or until it's about 200 degrees Fahrenheit in the middle, or a cake tester comes out with just damp crumbs. So now I have my pain d'épices. It smells beautiful, it looks lovely, and I've let it cool almost all the way, but I'm a little impatient to try it. So it's got a nice crust. I do recommend slicing this with a bread knife. And I find that I like this treated somewhere between a bread and a cake. So I cut myself a nice thick slice like I would a cake. But then if it's not freshly made, I often love to toast it before I spread some butter on it so that the butter kind of melts in. But this is so freshly made and still ever so slightly warm. So I'm gonna just eat it as is with a little smear of butter. I've got some good Irish butter here. And I like plenty of butter. And because it is the afternoon and I don't want to have any more caffeine today, I'm having some of the Carpathian mountain tea from Health from Transylvania. This is a beautiful blend of blackberry leaves and bilberry leaves and some flowers. I believe there's some elderflowers in here, and it's just a very kind of gentle, herbaceous, earthy blend of teas that is lovely in the afternoon with something sweet, because it doesn't have that sweet flavor that a lot of herbal teas have, but it doesn't have any caffeine, so I can drink it later in the afternoon without worrying about being up half the night. And I think it will go beautifully with this pain d'épices. This cake has a very interesting texture. It's not quite dry, but it is almost a little bready, which is why I do like to toast this and treat it almost like a slice of bread instead of a cake. But it's got that sweetness. The flavor, the dominant flavor that comes through is the honey. So if you have a really good flavorful honey, I definitely recommend you use it in this recipe. Originally, this probably would have been made with buckwheat honey from Brittany, which I think would be amazing. I just don't have buckwheat honey right now. And when I use my wildflower honey, which has a bit of a stronger flavor than the wild rose honey, that flavor comes through so strongly. But you get that. Okay, my camera battery died. I guess I should have charged it before filming this. But we're back. As I was saying, You get a little bite of the spices. I find that the ginger and the pepper come through very strongly. It's not overwhelmed by the cinnamon, which is not my favorite spice flavor. And it just goes so beautifully with this beautiful herbal tea, which is particularly appropriate because at the time that this bread or cake was first mentioned in history, tea didn't exist in France. And even in 1694, when the dictionary was published, tea was very much a beverage of the wealthy. And this cake was very much a folk baked good. It was kind of a country treat, not necessarily something that would be considered extremely fine. Although spices weren't cheap. But I think that it's more likely that at its origins, this cake would have been enjoyed with a nice mug of herbal tea than with true tea that would have been imported from China. So I hope you enjoyed this semi-historical baking with Jenn. A lovely treat to have with your tea. This week I made pain d'épices, or French spice cake, and I hope I will see you again sometime. Bye.